marking is done. But let's dive into this student's essay to see what we can learn. So here is a representative question from Macbeth, and it's about Macbeth and Banquo. Now, our first issue is that the question will always say, starting with this moment in the play. Well, I'm going to give you at least 2 reasons why my advice is do not start with the extract and this moment in the play. Don't do it. The first reason is that the exam mark scheme doesn't need you to think about that moment in the play. But even more important than that, if you start with the extract, you will prevent yourself from getting into level 6. It's really hard to get the top grades if you start with the extract. Let me show you what else is in the mark scheme. It says a candidate needs to have a well-structured argument and has a conceptualized approach. Well, you can't write a well-structured argument if you have to interrupt it by starting with the extract. Logically, you would be developing your argument and the extract would fit in wherever it fits in that argument. It's not going to be at the beginning though. So why would the exam board do that? Why would they tell you to start at this moment in the play when it actually makes it so difficult for you to get the top marks? Well, believe it or not, the examiners think they're doing you a favour. So giving you an extract is to help those students who just don't know the play. Remember, everyone has to sit this exam, no matter how uneducated or lazy they might be, and the examiners don't want anyone to outright fail and get a U, so they're thinking, well, at least if this student hasn't studied Macbeth at all, they'll be able to get some marks by referring to the extract. Of course, what they haven't done is thought, well, how is this extract actually going to penalise the students who deserve the top grades? The next area that students get wrong is they don't start with a thesis, or if they do have a thesis, it doesn't have at least 3 parts to it. The 3-part thesis helps you plan your answer. I'll show you what I mean here. So here's the beginning of an answer. In the play Macbeth by William Shakespeare, Banquo and Macbeth are considered to be at first dear friends until power and corruption consumes Macbeth, which leads to his betrayal of Banquo. So this has one idea in it. You're not going to be able to build an argument if you've only got one idea. So now I'm going to show you how a thesis will help you plan the essay before you even get into the exam. So whatever the question is on Banquo, these 3 things represented by my bullet points will always be part of your thesis. So number 1, Banquo was believed to be a historical ancestor to King James. Now, crucially, Shakespeare changes the details from the histories. So in the history that was known at the time, Banquo helped Macbeth to kill Duncan. Well, obviously, Shakespeare doesn't want to show that King James had a murderous, treacherous ancestor. So instead, he changes Banquo to a noble figure who refuses to fall in with Macbeth's plan to kill Duncan. Now, why does he want to flatter King James? Well, we now get to Shakespeare the businessman. King James became Shakespeare's patron, which basically means he sponsored, paying huge amounts of money. This made Shakespeare's acting troupe the top acting troupe in the country. It made Shakespeare the modern equivalent of a millionaire. It also meant that Shakespeare got to perform Macbeth and many of his other plays, not in the theatre with the hoi polloi, the rabble, the normal man in the street, but in front of the nobles at King James's palace. Now, this was so important because it gives Shakespeare access to every rich man in London. So flattering King James ensures Shakespeare's financial security. Then we have a third idea. Shakespeare uses Banquo as a moral counterpoint. That means a contrast here to Macbeth. So Macbeth and Banquo begin the play almost as equals, but they take very opposite reactions to the witches and the witches' prophecies, and Shakespeare is using this in a didactic way. He's teaching the audience a lesson. You need to be more like Banquo and less like Macbeth. The point of writing out your thesis statement like this for your revision is that it will fit every single time the question comes up on that character. So let me show you how this would work if we had to apply it to the supernatural. Banquo refuses to be influenced by the supernatural nature of the witches, just as King James refused to be a victim of witchcraft and wrote his book Demonology. You'll remember that Banquo actually asks the witches if you can see into the seeds of time and see which grain will grow and which will not. In other words, he questions the witches, which is exactly what King James does in his lifetime. Obviously, including the supernatural and witchcraft, and Banquo's reaction to it is a way of flattering King James and pandering to his interests. And so Banquo now becomes a moral counterpoint in that he resists the supernatural, whereas Macbeth seeks the supernatural out. Remember, he goes back to the witches a second time, and he acts evilly based on their prophecies. So you now have proof that having your thesis nailed down before you ever go into the exam helps you realise that you'll be able to use that thesis 100% whatever the question is on that character. Now you'll notice the mark scheme is divided into 3 columns. So we have the mark, the typical features, and how to arrive at a mark. Once you've decided whether the answer is convincing and critical, or thoughtful and developed, or clear understanding, only then do you start looking at the typical features. Let's go ahead and put those next to the essay. So here they are, so we can refer to them as we go. Well, we looked at the thesis, which only had one idea in it. That idea was thoughtful, but it's clearly not developed if it's only one idea. In this extract, Banquo is still loyal to Macbeth when he states that his duties are forever knit, after Macbeth says, "And I will request your presence." This shows that even though Banquo is weary, he still has trust in his friend and a duty to his country. So we've got more than one idea in there. It's definitely thoughtful. The use of the adverb forever displays Banquo's promise to fulfill his responsibilities. Well, because our student doesn't tell us whether these responsibilities are towards Macbeth or towards his country or his conscience, we're not yet fully thoughtful or convincing. I know the student knows the answers to that question, but they haven't spelt it out as an argument. So taken as a whole, we're going to say this paragraph is no more than thoughtful. Shakespeare may have chosen such a tight-knit bond for Macbeth and Banquo to shock the audience when Macbeth ultimately betrays Banquo. Because of Shakespeare's consistently writing tragedies, this leaves the audience to question what way this story takes a devastating turn. Well, this is actually a point about the nature of tragic theatre. But the student hasn't really explained that properly. Why has Shakespeare written this as a tragedy? Well, let's go back to our thesis. This is a play about the rights to succession, about who becomes king. So you should know about the Gunpowder Plot in 1605, and the play is performed just after that, in reaction to it. Now we get a sense of the kind of tragedy that Shakespeare's trying to avoid. King James could have become super violent like Macbeth does, pursuing vengeance where Macbeth pursued ambition. Actually, it would be the same, King James wanting to cling on to power and turning to violence to do it, just as Macbeth does in the play. But instead, Shakespeare offers up the example of Banquo as an antidote to violence. He's trying to train King James in proper kingship. A huge number of the people watching the play at court would have been in Parliament, including King James. They would all have been blown to smithereens. Now, where was King James going to go and fight that war? It would have to be against the enemy within, Catholics in his own country. We're talking civil war here. So at the minute, this paragraph definitely has clear understanding and is only just a little bit thoughtful. Banquo's selflessness is a huge contrast to Macbeth, as society at the time believed that loyalty to the king was equivalent to holiness because of the belief that the king was divinely appointed by God. Well, we've got clear understanding there, and this is starting to be a developed point, especially if we link it to the way Banquo behaves. Are we going to see some examples of his selflessness? Banquo's suspicion of Macbeth grows stronger in the play and in this extract when he states, "I fear thou playedst most foully for it," and "I fight of treasonous malice," after questioning whether Macbeth murdered Duncan. This reveals that perhaps both Macbeth and Banquo consider the country to be of the utmost importance because of Macbeth's foul actions and Banquo's disapproval of them. So this kind of makes sense. The writer's suggesting that Macbeth puts the country first, which is why he tries to seize it for himself, and Banquo puts the country first, which is why he doesn't help Macbeth in seizing it. But that really isn't linked to these two quotations here. Now, I know the student could easily have linked them, but by just listing these quotations and not taking the time to link those to their argument, then they haven't presented a really good argument. So again, this is thoughtful, but the argument isn't developed because those links aren't there. Next, we have some analysis of single word quotations. The contrasting verbs, fear and fight, demonstrate these opposing ideas because fighting soldiers are traditionally brave. These illustrate the fact royalty is both equally important to them because of their willingness to commit acts of violence. Then the student makes that relevant to the question. Shakespeare may have intended to teach the audience how easily even the most honourable people can be misled. This could make the audience have a distaste for Macbeth's selfishness and fear Banquo's fate. Now that is a developed explanation. We've got more than two parts to it, so we've got a thoughtful and developed consideration. It's not yet convincing because it's not forming an argument for the whole essay. Now the reason for that is the student has just gone to the extract and started to quote because that's how they've been trained. But as I showed you at the beginning, that stopped them developing an argument which they're putting forward through the whole essay. The next problem that students have is when they start with the extract, they stop following the play chronologically. And that means you end up with references all over the place, quotations all over the place, and they don't follow an argument. Let's see what that looks like. So here is where the student writes about moments elsewhere in the play. Even after Macbeth commits these heinous acts, his ever-growing guilt shows how close the bond he and Banquo had. This is revealed when he states, "Stars, hide your fires." Well, that doesn't really suggest the bond at all, does it? He's actually asking for God not to see what his evil thoughts are about killing Duncan. And while hallucinating, he says, "Never shake thy gory locks." So this now is about Banquo, but it happens much later in the play once Banquo is dead and his ghost has appeared. By this point in the play, his sorrow for his malicious betrayal is clear as it takes on a physical form to haunt him. Brilliant. And he also pleads with the stars to hide his dark ambition for the crown. Well, that's true, but writing about it in this way makes it seem as though these actions take place at the same time. Whereas, if she had been able to follow through chronologically, she would be showing how Macbeth has changed. The paragraph finishes with some analysis. The use of the imperative, "never shake thy gory locks," means he is commanding his manifestation of guilt to leave him because he can't handle it. Well, first, that is colloquial, so don't do it. And second, how does this fit into the argument? Is the student going to go on to argue that actually the final straw that stops Macbeth being sane is the murder of Banquo? Is the student going to argue that murdering Banquo leads to the rest of the bloodshed in the play or not? Now, I'm not saying they have to, as in there's a right answer, but I am saying that if it goes in the essay, then it has to build towards a conclusion, and this doesn't. So when we come to assess it, are we saying it's convincing or thoughtful or clear? Well, we'll give the benefit of the doubt to thoughtful here. Let's see how the ideas develop later in the essay. Macbeth's guilt of his betrayal manifests itself through blood. This is made clear when he asks, "Will all Neptune's oceans wash this blood?" This shows that he's aware of the weight of his betrayal of the ones close to him, especially Banquo, since his actions were irreversible. Now, I know what the student means here, but there is a problem. These are Macbeth's words just after he's killed the king. Nothing to do with the murder of Banquo. Now, what she might mean to say is, after killing Duncan, he realises that he'll never be able to get rid of his guilt because his action is irreversible, which is great, and therefore he won't be able to get rid of the guilt of killing Banquo because his actions are irreversible. But it also demands the question, doesn't it? Why, if he felt all this guilt when he was killing Duncan, does he still go ahead and kill Banquo and take on that extra level of guilt? That's what would have been needed to get into convincing and critical, because it would have been an exploration, asking why. Here the student doesn't ask why, so we're stuck at thoughtful. The use of this rhetorical question demonstrates that he is unsure of whether he can ever be forgiven and whether he deserves it, presumably forgiveness. So we're getting a bit more thoughtful here. It's definitely an exploration. The collective noun all emphasises this. Okay, that's true. So now we do have much better analysis of the quotation. So it's a very clear exploration, and this is the best paragraph in the essay so far. Shakespeare may have done this as a lesson to the audience to show the dangers of greed and overambition. Well, yes, but again, that's a bit vague. Who is the audience? Here's where you can see how our thesis statement would have been so useful. The audience is at the court of King James. So why is he trying to teach all the nobles to be more like Banquo and not like Macbeth? Well, because of the 1605 gunpowder plot, because of the mood in the country to replace King James. Who would he be replaced with? Well, with another noble family, someone else plotting at court. That person or persons are actually there watching the play, and Shakespeare is reaching a hand out to them and tapping them on the shoulder and saying, don't even think about it. Look at the consequences of your betrayal. You will go mad through guilt, and anyway, your plan will fail, just as Macbeth's failed. So you can see that would have made this explanation of the audience much more powerful, much more exploratory, a convincing analysis rather than a thoughtful one. Now, I asked this student to mark her own work before I looked at it, and so this is the feedback she gave herself. Now, although I agree with everything she says, she hasn't focused on the key thing, which is the need to build a conceptualized argument. So we're asking, how could a student embed quotations well and zoom in on words well and not get really great marks? Well, the answer to that is where we started in the mark scheme. You're not writing a well-structured argument and you're not writing a conceptualized response. In fact, the way you've been taught, and this would apply to many students in many schools, the way you've been taught is not to write an argument and not to write a conceptualized response. Instead, the way this student thinks about essay writing is it's got to have these ingredients in it, and I've highlighted the ingredients in yellow. But instead, don't think of these as ingredients. You have to think of them as part of a recipe. The recipe is your essay plan, your argument. And where does the argument start? With your thesis. Now, this means your revision is really, really easy. For each character, you just have to write a 3-bullet point thesis and memorize it. That's going to be your essay plan for whatever exam question comes up. So with this student's essay, we've had clear understanding everywhere, thoughtfulness in most places, and one paragraph that moves towards exploration. So on balance, we can say that the mark is going to be at the top of thoughtful and developed. Not the very top, but at the top. So I'm going for a mark of 23 out of 30. Now I go to the next two columns to see if my instincts are correct. So is it a response to the task? Yes. And to the whole text? Yes, it is. But remember those quotations from different parts of the text that were jammed together? So I'm now starting to come for a lower mark. Examination of the writer's methods with subject terminology. Yep, there was plenty of terminology in there. I'm happy with that. And how do the methods create meaning? Yep, that's where the thoughtful bit was. So I'm still going to be happy that it's in this band. Do we have context in there and perspectives? Yes, not at massively high level, but they're there. So I'm now coming down to 21 or 22 marks. My next step is to read across to the final column. Now, giving it 21 or 22 means it's at the bottom of the level. So let's have a look. Starting to develop elements of thoughtful consideration and or examination of writers' methods. Well, that now sounds a bit too stingy, so I can't give it 21. I've got to go up to 22. Let's see what it says about the top of the level. Candidate's response is thoughtful, detailed, developed, yeah. Takes a considered approach. Well, I might say it wasn't that well considered, was it? Wasn't a logical argument. But it does have integrated quotations and some interpretation. Okay, so I'm quite happy that it's not at the top of the level, which means I'm now going to give it 22 out of 30. Now, grading gets a little complicated. So if you'd just given me this essay and asked me to give it a grade, I would have said, yeah, that's a B grade, or as we say nowadays, a grade 6. But if I look at the numbers, she got 22 out of 30, which is 73%. So let's look at the AQA grade boundaries, the last ones published for 2019. Here is English literature, and a score of 98 out of 160 was the beginning of a grade 6, and 113 out of 160 was the beginning of a grade 7. And when we convert those grade boundaries into percentages, you can see that the essay just sneaks into a grade 7. So even though I personally would never give it a grade 7. Now that is why English examiners will very often disagree with each other. It's really difficult to arrive at a grade. But partly this is because this student, and possibly you, are leaving your grade to chance. Because if the essay had begun with a 3-part thesis that relied heavily on context to give us interpretations, and had then followed through the play chronologically to show how the character developed, and therefore the presentation of the character developed, the essay would always be building towards a convincing argument. And that would remove the element of doubt. There would be no question of any examiner saying, maybe it's a grade 6. It would be at least a grade 7. This percentage would have been higher, and the debate then would have been, well, is it a grade 7 or a grade 8 or even a grade 9? Now, if you would like some examples of even better essays of higher grades for Macbeth, then click on one of the two appearing now. Or is it now? See you soon on my channel.